Why, hello again, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about Gentile attitudes toward Jews and Judaism. And as part of this, at the tail end of this, I want to be looking at Paul's attitude or Paul's form of Judaism in relation to all of the Gentiles that he was coming into contact with and that he was teaching. And so I just want to start off by saying, first of all, thank you for coming to this point with me. I appreciate it. I'm glad to see that there's interest in these videos. And secondly, if the video quality sounds a little bit different today, I'm in my kitchen. I'm normally somewhere else, but that just happens to work out today. So that's what we're going to be doing. And so as for our first slide, actually, as you can see, our sources are on the screen. They are starting to change as we are moving forward in history. We are now at the end of the first century, getting into the second century. This kind of goes into the next century, but in a few of the next presentations, we'll actually be backtracking, such as when we get to the destruction of the temple, which happens in 70 CE, or 80, depending on what time system you want to deal with. CE just means Common Era. AD means Anno Domini, which is Latin for in the year of our Lord. It's the same thing, basically. So we'll be looking at something that spans into the next century. And so today will be a little bit different, if you want to take a look at our overview here. Today is going to be a little bit sporadic. It's not going to be a pleasant story per se, but it's going to be lots of little pieces of a larger puzzle. And hopefully by the end of this, we get a better idea of what Gentile attitudes were like, both positive and negative, and what they actually did about this. So, but we'll actually be looking at more of the positive action today, and I think that throughout this lecture series, we'll be addressing the negatives sufficiently. So, but today we're going to be focusing on the positives. And as you can see at the bottom, right underneath the bullet points there, here are some of the Roman writers that we'll be looking at today, such as Juvenal, Plutarch, Seneca, Seutonius, Livy, Tacitus, and Modestinus. And so we are actually now leaving the era, the time frame of the New Testament, and we're kind of starting to move, actually we're starting before and going into it and afterwards. So we're covering almost a century here. But we're using sources outside of the New Testament because we want to know what were Gentiles' views about Jews and Judaism. So who do you go to? The Gentiles. So, if any of you didn't know, that was the Ghostbusters theme. Anyway, so we'll be starting with a positive. Just because I think that's the best way to start things off with is a positive. Well, let's talk about the concept of religio licita, which is, if you know a little bit of Latin, you'll realize that means religion licit, meaning permitted or permissible, permitted. The Romans and the Greeks admired old things because in antiquity, old things were considered stable, reliable, honorable, time-tested, and even glorious to a certain extent. It's like, well, you must have been doing something right to, be around for 300, 400, or 500 years or 1,000 years. And so old things, whether you agreed with that system or not, they were intrinsically valuable to Gentiles. And that's why when Alexander the Great, when he had conquered most of the known world at that point, at least in the West and in the Middle East, when he had conquered from Greece to India, basically, to Pakistan, that's why he never said, I'm replacing your culture with mine, but simply, I'm adding to your culture mine. Because he realized that not only were these very old cultures and very old religions powerful and influential, but he even had some respect for them. And I don't think that we think about the ancient world as being multicultural or tolerant, but they actually were to a certain degree, for better or worse. And so Alexander the Great goes around and he just starts mixing all the different religions and cultures of much of the world, at least, with Hellenistic concepts and philosophy and culture and ideas and language and so on, and art as well. But this is something that actually continued into the Roman era. In fact, the Romans had taken a lot from Greek culture, and so the Romans kind of always looked up to the Greeks, and they said, well, we know that they're better, but we want to be better, and we have some positive things, and so we want to take all their good stuff and combine it with our good stuff. So it's kind of like double syncretism. Syncretism is just the process or the system by which you combine two things, right? Hellenism and Judaism. You had Hellenistic Jews, right? That's a synchronistic lifestyle. But anyways, and so old religions or old cultures were considered the opposites of chaos and disorder. And so when you're a law and order society like Rome, you like old, stable, dusty things. Because not only do they seem to work, not only are they time tested, not only are they popular, at least where they're practiced or accepted, but it's the very opposite of what Rome was fighting against. Or basically, they stood for stability and peace, and this is exactly what Rome was trying to accomplish with the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, the era that Rome was ruling the Mediterranean and had established relative peace for actually quite a while. And so by accepting these religions and permitting these religions, they were actually helping to maintain peace in the empire. And whenever a dangerous cult would spring up, they would try to suppress that because these dangerous cults or these new religions were considered revolutionary. They were not old. They were not time-tested or honorable or reliable. They were dangerous and new, right? Kind of see where we're going with this? So, let's see. Also, with ancient cultures such as the Jewish religion, they had the ability to maintain social order and stability, like we had already mentioned. However, Gentile converts to Judaism or Noahidism, which, by the way, if you don't know what Noahidism is, it's simply a toned-down version of Judaism. There's less commandments, but you are just as saved, you could say. You have just as much of a place in the world to come. You just simply have less obligations, and so that was very attractive to many Gentiles at that time because they didn't have to get circumcised. And for us men, that's very appealing. Get circumcised or don't get circumcised. So a lot of Gentiles actually opted for that system where they would keep maybe 7 to 10 laws, and that's all that they had to do to be a righteous Gentile. Now, to be a righteous Jew, you had to keep the 613 commandments. And especially if you were a priest, then you would have more commandments than the average Israelite. And if you were just the average Israelite, you wouldn't have all the 613. But I think that those who study the Torah are familiar with that concept already. So, anyways, these Gentile converts to Judaism, or Noahidism, which is actually a part of Judaism, they were not secured by Rome's policy of religio licita, because only ancestral religions were protected, meaning that conversion to non-ancestral religions was highly discouraged by the Roman government because religio licita was only in place to appease people. It's not because they loved the diversity of religion. Ideally there would be one Roman language, Latin, maybe Greek for academics, and one Roman culture, one Roman religion or priestly cult, one Roman culture, and so on. But Rome knew that was impossible and was highly impractical. So they said, well, given our circumstances, this is going to have to work. So let's just permit these religions and try to control them from a distance so they don't get out of hand and cause us problems. And so, while they permitted people to practice their own religions, you basically were not allowed to switch religions. You weren't allowed to, if you were a Gentile, you weren't allowed to become a Jew. Even though, according to biblical law, that was entirely permissible and even a good thing. But Rome did not smile on this. They did not accept this at all. Now, were there some people who got away with it? Sure there were. In fact, we know some of them because they're mentioned in rabbinic writings, and some of them even went on to become rabbis. Some of these rabbis are even still taught in Judaism today. So, they had a pretty big impact. Additionally, Augustus permits the Jews to observe their religion outside of Judea. So even though the Jews have been dispersed, he says, I understand that your people have been dispersed. You're not all actually living in your ancestral homeland. Given that that's the situation, and given that we can't just round everyone up and send them back, I will permit all the Jews who are living in Greece, Turkey, or Asia Minor, Rome, Judea, Egypt, Tunisia, Libya, Spain, Gaul. I don't know if there's any Jews in Gaul at that time, but it wouldn't surprise me, honestly. But basically, wherever they were permitted to worship the gods of their forefathers. And for the Jews, they had only one. So it's made things simpler in some respects. Now, according to the Greek papyri, which is papyri is related to the word papyrus, right? It's just a document from ancient times. There is this Greek papyri in the British Museum, 1912, lines 73 through 103. And it says, this is in regards to imperial demands of tolerance for Jews. So, according to this document, it says, I entreat you, the Alexandrians, to behave tolerantly and benevolently, nicely, toward the Jews, since they have lived in the same city as you have for many years, actually hundreds of years, and not to abuse the religious rites which they practice in the worship of their God. Notice that he's aware of monotheism, of their God, but to allow them to observe their own customs, which they observed also in the time of the deified Augustus. So, the temple cult already exists, where they're deifying the emperors, but they're allowing people to worship their own gods still. Now, this is actually going to be a problem later on. This is one of the main reasons that Christians were persecutors, because they had switched to a different religion. The empire thought that they had all converted to Judaism, or they had become Noahides. And not only that, but they weren't worshiping the emperor and dumping out wine onto the floor. That was an offering back in the day. It's called a drink offering, basically. Or you wouldn't give some spices to the altar of the emperor or something like that. So that would later go on to cause some problems. And we see some of this already in this document here. But without reservation, I order the Jews not to agitate for more indulgence than they enjoyed in the past, and not to send in the future a second separate delegation as if they live in a separate city. So basically he's saying, look, the Jews can practice their own religion, but you have to be part of the city. You can't just isolate yourselves and request from the emperor to have special rights that the other Alexandrian Egyptian population doesn't have. That's all he's saying. Otherwise, if you do this, I will prosecute them in every way as transmitters of a general disease infecting the whole world. Sounds pretty serious. If, however, both sides leave behind their quarrels and indicate a willingness to live together in tolerance and benevolence, then I will show the utmost care for the city. So basically, if y'all can play nice, I will be very nice to you. But if you cause the empire trouble, if you violate the Pax Romana, then you give me trouble, I give you trouble. Now, according to Juvenal, which, by the way, in Latin, there is no J sound, it's a Y, so it would have been juvenal, but that sounds kind of ridiculous, and everybody calls him Juvenal, so. But that's just so that you know. Juvenal, who is a Roman satirist, today would be like a comedian, a cartoonist. They poke fun at society in a kind of a funny way, or they try to, at least. So, according to As the Romans Do, or As the Romans Did, we read, Juvenal, the Roman satirist, disliked foreigners in Rome. His views were probably typical of those native-born Romans who saw foreigners getting ahead of them and who resented their success. So this is a negative thing, right? We see some either nationalism or patriotism, or even potentially racism, or simply just fear of the unknown, right? There's many reasons why people don't like foreigners. Sometimes it's religious reasons, racial reasons, economic reasons. You're just scared of what they're going to be like, right? Maybe you don't think that they're going to be loyal to your country and they're going to instigate a revolt or something, which is what Pharaoh thought that the Jews were going to do in Egypt, right? And that's why he starts persecuting them. Now, Juvenal writes in his satires, the violent drunk stands in front of me and orders me to halt, right? He's telling this story about something that happened to him when he's walking around Rome. And he meets this violent drunk. This violent drunk stands in front of me and orders me to halt. And you have to obey. What else can you do when a maniac and one stronger than you coerces you? Where are you coming from? He shouts. At whose house did you have your dinner of vinegar and beans? Vinegar and beans. What shoemaker shared with you his leeks and lips of a boiled sheep? Ooh, that sounds tasty. Oh, you won't answer? Speak or I'll kick you. Apparently knows karate, right? Speak or I'll kick you. Tell me where you hang out. In what Jew's prayer house can I find you? Whether you try to speak or shrink back in silence, it's all the same. In either case, they mug you. So basically, Juvenal's telling probably a made-up story, a made-up scenario, and what you might consider the villain, who's this drunkard, the violent drunk, he uses the term Jew as an insult. He's like, who do you hang out with? Who do you eat with? What shoemaker shared his food with you? What kind of Jewish synagogue do you hang out with, right? This is an insult. And today it doesn't really make any sense because we don't insult people really like that anymore. At least in the same way. And so we can find that Juvenal, who again, he's trying to speak for the people in a comedic way and address things that might be kind of sensitive. It's kind of one of the things that everybody feels and everyone knows, but people don't always come right out and admit it. So he might be alluding to this in one of his satires. Another negative thing comes from Seutonius and Plutarch. These are two separate quotes from two separate men. Seutonius says, the emperor Tiberius suppressed foreign cults. Cult is just the Latin word for religion, right? Every religion is a cult, and every cult is a religion. But just in modern times, I think from the 1980s, the cult has kind of taken on this scary, almost kind of terroristic mind control connotation, simply because modern cults are like that. And so the word has been redefined because of modern culture. But in an academic sense, a cult is entirely innocent. It just means religion in Latin. So try not to get hung up on that. So the Emperor Tiberius suppressed foreign cults. He suppressed foreign religions, such as the Egyptian and Jewish religions. So the Romans consider Judaism a cult. And by extension, they considered Christianity a cult, because Christianity around this time was still considered part of Judaism or linked with Judaism somehow. The Romans never really figured it out easily until a long time after this. So he suppresses foreign religions by forcing those who embraced such superstitions to burn their religious vestments and all their holy objects. Using the required military service as a pretext, he assigned young Jews to provinces with harsh conditions, harsher climates. And so basically, with the Emperor Tiberius, he's persecuting the Jewish people, the religion, and he wants them to burn their religious objects, and then sometimes he'll draft them into the military and send them on an expedition out in the middle of a desert or out in a very cold place or a very windy place, right? It's harsher climates. It's not going to be the Riviera in France, which at that time was called Gaul. It was a Celtic country. Now, Plutarch says something a little similar. He's kind of poking at the Jews again. He says, their own accounts, their own stories, sound like pure myth. But perhaps they have some serious reasons which they do not publish or make public as to why they abstain from pork. So basically, he's talking about how the Jewish religion, from his perspective, is very strange. And we find this in Christianity eventually, that Christians think that Judaism is very strange. And when you don't take the time to actually get to know people or get to know something, you begin to imagine their motives or imagine what they're doing. And this is kind of what he's doing here. He says, their religion is just pure myth. And, there's got to be some reason that they don't make public as to why they really abstain from pork. It can't be because God said so. It's got to be something secret and mysterious, right? Because mystery religions that were focused on mysterious things, if the phrase the mystery of the Trinity rings a bell, that's kind of where this comes out of. Mystery religions were very, very, very popular in the first century. And there was lots of these little ones, a lot of them coming out of either Persia or Egypt, sometimes out of Greece. They were coming into Rome, and this kind of sparked some xenophobic attitudes among certain Romans. And so basically, when you have a lot of these new religions coming in, the Romans are like, we want nothing to do with this. Let's just stick with the old Roman stuff that we had. It's perfectly fine. All this new stuff is dangerous. And, they're incestual, and they're murdering people, and they do crazy rituals in the middle of the night. And this is what they thought about a lot of different religions. And because Judaism was still coming into Roman society, they thought it was new, even though it had existed for 1400 years. So we see that their Judaism is being called, it's a foreign cult. They embrace superstition. Their stories sound like pure myth. And people doubt that the biblical God would command his people to do such absurd things like don't eat pork, right? Because the Romans love pork, and they're getting a lot of their pork out of France, which maybe that's why they went, and maybe that's why Julius Caesar invaded France to get all the pork. I don't know. Got to have that bacon. He's bringing home the bacon back to Rome, and that's how he became emperor. I'm just teasing, by the way. I'm just imagining how that scenario would play out. Anyways, accounts by Roman historians of the popularity of Judaism among Gentiles. So Judaism is gaining ground among Gentiles, and Gentiles are converting to Judaism, or they're getting involved with the local synagogue. They're very friendly with the Jewish people, their Jewish neighbors. And maybe they're starting to, they stop going to pagan temples, but they don't convert to Judaism, right? They become a Noahide. They take on the minimal commandments incumbent on a Gentile. And so other Gentiles are watching this process happen, and they're commenting on this. So Seneca says in his book De Superstitione, which again sounds like superstitions, which is basically just other religions, not us, right? That's what superstition is normally defined as. Um, Anyways, Seneca says, meanwhile, the customs of this accursed race, the Jews, have gained such influence that they are now received throughout the entire world, all the world. The vanquished, the Jews, have given laws to their victors, the Romans, because remember the Romans had conquered Judea. The Jews, however, are aware of the origin and meaning of their rites. The greater part of the people go through a ritual not knowing why they do so. So he's like, they're brainwashing Roman society, but they themselves don't even know what they're doing. Right? He's trying to slander them, saying they're a bunch of idiots and we're giving in to the idiots. We need to stop this. Right? And so, what is he trying to do? He's trying to say, they're bad, we're good, don't go over to them. Right? That's kind of the simple down version of what he's saying. Juvenal likewise says, some who have had a father who, listen to what he says, there are certain people who their dad, their father, reveres the Sabbath, worships nothing but the clouds. Imagine what that looks like. You look up into the sky and you pray. Gentiles look at them and they're like, what are you doing? They're praying to the clouds. Where's your idol? Go pray to your idol. And then, obviously the person's going to say, we don't have idols. And the Gentile's going to say, oh, well, they're just worshiping the clouds. I mean, you got to worship something. What are you going to worship? Just invisible air? Right? It didn't enter their mind that these people, Jews who practice Judaism and Gentile Noahides, they never imagined that they don't use idols. They don't use objects. They don't dedicate their religious reverence or worship to a thing, right? And so that's what he means by they worship the clouds, right? They're not actually worshiping the clouds, but when they look up in the sky and they pray toward God, that's what Gentiles think because, to put it bluntly, they're ignorant, they don't know what they're talking about, and they're not familiar with the Bible. So look at what he says. He says, some who have a father who reveres the Sabbath, worships nothing but the clouds and the divinity of the heavens, right? The godliness somewhere up in the sky, and see no difference between swine's flesh from pork, from which their fathers abstained, and that of a human being. So basically he's saying, we eat pork all the time, but these people, they stay away from eating pork just like they would stay away from eating a human being. Like, eating pork is just as bad as cannibalism. And in time, they take to circumcision. Oh no, it's the end of the world. Having been wont to flout the laws of Rome, they're doing illegal things. They learn and practice and revere the Jewish law instead of the Roman law, and all that Moses handed down in his secret book. Ooh, secrets. We don't know what's really in that book, but I'm sure it's horrible. I'm sure it's anti-Roman. Right? This is kind of the conspiratorial mindset that some of these Romans had, and that's why it was easy to flare up the people and say, these people are doing crazy things. Let's get them. Let's throw them in a coliseum and, let lions rip them apart. And people had no problem with that because the mainstream media would communicate to them that these people were malefactors, they were evil people, anti-Roman, they were not patriotic. They hated the country, and they were haters of humanity. They just hated people, and they were selfish, and they were evil. That's how they were being cast at this time. they learn and practice and revere the Jewish law, the Torah, and all that Moses handed down in his secret book, forbidding to point out the way to not the way to any not worshiping the same rites. So basically, you're not allowed to teach the Torah to pagans. They're just going to misuse it. They're just going to corrupt it. And this is actually part of halakha, right? This is a history and halakha class. It is a halakhic principle that you are not permitted to teach Torah to pagans, other than very basic things like there's one God, don't worship idols, love one another. Just very, very, very basic things. You are not allowed to invite pagans to Passover Seder, for example. You cannot teach them how to tie tzitzit, the tassels on the garments. You cannot get into the details. You can teach them very basic things. And this is actually what Juvenal, I think, is alluding to here. That they're forbidding to point out the way to any not worshiping the same rituals, and conducting none but the circumcised to the desired fountain. The desired fountain might be a baptismal pool or something, or it might be metaphorical for sources of knowledge. For all which the Father was to blame, who gave up every seventh day to idleness. So resting on the Sabbath day is lazy, according to the Romans. Keeping it apart from all the concerns of life. Oh, as if that's so bad. As just forgetting about life for one day and having a nice time, taking a break. Apparently, that's the end of the world to Juvenal and other Romans. Now we find this interesting character, Queen Helena, of the kingdom of Adiabene. I think that's how it's pronounced. And we find her mentioned actually in various places, including Josephus and the Talmud. And we find an event that she participated in, possibly mentioned a few times in the New Testament itself. So, starting with Josephus, Josephus says, Helena, queen of Adiabene, and her son Izates changed their course of life and embraced the Jewish custom. And basically, this is an ancient kingdom around modern-day Armenia, roughly, or Eastern Turkey. It no longer exists, but it used to be a kingdom in the first century. And the royal house, now the people did not become Jews, but the queen and some of her family converted to Judaism. And this is the first time, I think, in history where foreign governments begin accepting Judaism. Now, were they Noahides before that? Who knows? I think it's very possible, and it's probably even the case, because you can't convert to Judaism without first being a Noahide. So it's pretty strongly assumed that they were. Josephus says elsewhere in Antiquities, when her son Izates was informed of this famine, so there's a famine going on, he sent great sums of money to the principal men in Jerusalem. So basically there's a famine, and this royal house that had converted to Judaism, they're sending money to Jerusalem to help out with the famine. Now, what's interesting, we read 1 Corinthians 16, 2 Corinthians 8 through 9 possibly, and Romans 15. We find that there's a famine going on in the mid to late first century. And wouldn't you have it, it fits awfully close to the time of Queen Helena and her son Izates. And so, is this the same famine? Scholars believe that it is. Now, there's not 100% undeniable concrete proof that it is, because maybe there was two famines, who knows. But we find, even if it was two different famines, which I don't think so, I think it was the same famine. But let's say that even if it was two different famines, we still see the Nazarenes and these Jewish converts, Queen Helena and her son Izates, doing the same thing. They're sending money to the poor in Jerusalem. And for the Nazarenes, one of Paul's main missions this is a surprise to people, but one of his main missions was actually to collect money from the Gentiles to bring it to Jerusalem. And we see that this is what's going on. We see that other people are doing this too. So I think that it lines up very nicely. I don't have 100% proof, but I think that the evidence is rather strong. And really, it doesn't really matter a whole lot, but I think it's nice to be able to have some kind of something to hold on to, some facts that we can depend on. Now, in the Talmud, we read, it is related that Queen Helena, when her son went to war, said, "If my son returns in peace from the war, I shall be a Nazarite for 7 years." So she's taking a Nazarite vow right now. Interestingly, James says for Paul and 4 other believers to do the same thing in Acts 21. At the end of 7 years, she went up to the land of Israel, in Beit Hillel. Oh, here's Hillel. The house of Hillel ruled that she must be a Nazarite for a further 7 years. The issue as to why this is, it's very complicated. They're not trying to screw her over. It is an actual legitimate legal issue, which if you want to study that out more, you're welcome to. Towards the end of this 7 years, she contracted ritual defilement. And so altogether, she was a Nazarite for 21 years. Because you cannot be defiled while you're a Nazarite. You basically have to start over if you are defiled. And so she did her 7 years, and the house of Hillel said, "Actually, sorry to inform you, but you actually need to do it another 7 years for legal reasons." She does it another 7 years, so 14 years total. Then she becomes defiled by the end of it, so she has to start all over another 7 years. So, 21 years, which is not the end of the world. It's not bad. But that just shows their dedication, that she was serious about this. This was not just a political move. Sometimes you'll see the government supporting religion just for political reasons. But she was serious on this. She wanted to uphold the Torah. She was very genuine. She was a genuine convert. Also in the Talmud, we read Rabbi Judah said, the sukkah, or the tabernacle, the little tent that you make for Sukkot, or Feast of Tabernacles, the sukkah erected for Sukkot of Queen Helena in Lydda. If you're just listening to this, you might have to look at the screen because this might sound a little weird. The sukkah for Sukkot of Queen Helena in Lydda was higher than 20 ells. So it's higher than what it's technically supposed to be. But the rabbis used to go in and out of the sukkah, so they would come and visit her in her sukkah and make no remark about it. They wouldn't correct her. They wouldn't say, "Oh, you're sinning. Your sukkah is too high." No, they're being gracious. They say, she doesn't know. It was an accident. She's doing this with a good motive. It's not a big deal. Let's just leave her be. Let's not make a big deal out of it. And let's just be glad that she's here doing this at all. Because she doesn't have to. She chose to be a Jew. Let's just not say anything. Let's just have a nice time. And so, if only the Pharisees in the, if only some of the Pharisees in the New Testament would embrace such grace when they're constantly hassling Yeshua and his disciples and saying, "Oh, what about this? What about that? You're doing that. You're wrong. You're wrong." And he wasn't even wrong when they would come to him. That's the silly thing, is that sometimes Yeshua would out-Pharisee the Pharisees, and he knew the Torah and the Halacha better than them sometimes, such as healing the withered hand of a man on the Sabbath. This is actually something that I was studying recently, that according to the Talmud, one rabbi says that there is no cure for a withered hand. And on the Sabbath, there are certain medicines that you can take and that you can't take. And so if there's no cure for a withered hand, there's no medicine to take. If there's no medicine to take, that means that Yeshua is not illegally giving the man medicine, because there is no medicine. And so by doing a miracle, Yeshua is actually healing the man in a halakhically permissible way. And some of these Pharisees are still ragging on him, saying, oh, you're wrong, you're wrong, you're wrong. And Yeshua's like, shut up, I'm just helping the guy. And what's funny is that in the Talmud it even says that the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. It says the same thing. So Yeshua's kind of using this, and he's saying this to the Pharisees. He's like, shut up, I know this better than you. I know what I'm doing. Give me a break. Now another positive thing, kind of switching back to Gentile perceptions of Judaism, there was the Romans' attraction just to Eastern religions in general. They were considered mystical, they were experiential, whereas the Roman religion was just, you go offer a sacrifice and you go home. There was no sense of morality, there was no moral code, and it was boring. It was stupid. Nobody wanted to do it, but you did it out of fear and out of patriotism, which still goes on today. People use patriotism and fear to do other things in the name of religion, right? But here are just some of the points of what attracted the Romans to Eastern religions, particularly Judaism. So there was the simplicity of monotheism. Basically, you didn't have to manage a whole family of gods or deities. It's not, oh, well, if I offer sacrifices to this deity, then this other deity is going to get mad and jealous, so then I have to give her sacrifices too. And then this other god over here, he's going to get mad, so I have to do something for him. Managing all of these gods was too confusing, and sometimes it was impossible to please them all, which in that system, you're going to get smitten with a disease or war or a financial loss, or the love of your life won't fall in love with you, or something silly like that. And so just the simplicity of having to manage one God instead of 20 or 3 was very appealing to people. It's okay. This God says, here's the rules, here's what you do these, you're good with me. You good? And so it was very attractive for the Romans to do this. There was also the concept of the existence of a personal, loving deity. In the Roman religion, the gods didn't care who you were. They just wanted stuff from you, and that's it. There's also the existence of a moral deity, unlike the immoral Greek and Roman deities. So basically, the Roman and the Greek gods, they were perverse and corrupt. They were more immoral than people. And people started figuring this out. They're like, our gods suck. Our gods are committing all these types of debauchery. Why should we follow them? And so when the Jews come in, they introduce a good God, and people say, you know what, I can get on board with this. This is doable. There was also a moral code, and it was simple. You do it, you're good. 2-step program. And while there's multiple commandments, it was very simple. You don't have to try to figure out what your deity wants. In Judaism, it's God says this, and that's what makes him happy. Additionally, with this clear moral standard, nobody had to guess about, what was going to please the gods or what was going to offend them. And so with having these behavioral standards, this is something that the Roman religion lacked. And while the people knew what kind of offerings to offer, there was no kind of ethical or moral guidance coming from their deities. Additionally, Judaism's antiquity, as opposed to the younger, newer Greek philosophical schools, which were popular, this is something that played to its advantage. That these philosophical schools in Greece were, maybe 100 years old, 200 years old. Judaism was 1,300 years old. And so the Romans were like, wow, this is Look how ancient it is. It's so, wow, it's amazing. And while Hellenism and while Greek philosophy certainly had a big appeal in Rome, people realized it's like, these are just some kind of young hotshot philosophies out there. They don't know what they're talking about. Maybe in a few hundred years, maybe they'll be good religions. Also, some Romans wondered if the state religion was unreliable because Rome's enemies, namely Hannibal out of North Africa, namely because Rome's enemies kept trashing Italy and finding victory in battle against them. So basically the Romans realized, our gods aren't protecting us from foreign invasions. That when we go to war, we are not always winning. Obviously they've failed us. And so that caused them to start looking into other religions. And so these were things that were very attractive to the Romans. Additionally, the exotic attraction to Eastern religion by Westerners is that this is something that was very unfamiliar to Westerners. It was very mystical. It was very experiential. It was very, wow, it's mind-blowing. My religion in Italy is just you go through the actions and then you're done. This other stuff over here, there's spices, like smells. There's singing. There's food involved. There's teaching, like philosophical teaching. And so it was just so much more diverse and dynamic than the very boring, go fulfill your duty every Sunday kind of religion going on in Italy and Greece. Also, there was the sense of community, both local and internationally, is that you could feel a part of a group, and it gave people a sense of belonging. So, Roman society dismisses you, Greek society dismisses you. That's okay. We accept you. We don't know who you are other than a follower of the one true God. But you are our brother, and we love you, we will provide for you, we accept you. And so then communities started being built up, and you could go to these places as a refuge. And eventually in later times, the Christians in Rome, they started developing these social programs and providing welfare for their local communities. And the Roman government loved it because it took some of the burden off of them. Rome had a welfare system at this time, the oldest in the world from what I understand. And so when the church started picking up the slack from the empire, the Romans were like, maybe these Christians aren't too bad. Like I said, it encouraged the use of emotion during worship. It was not all cerebral. It wasn't all mental. And it wasn't all just, you go do it whether you like it or not. It was not just action-oriented. It was heart-oriented as well. This is because the Roman religion was impersonal, unemotional, and rife with formalism. Which, being formal isn't bad. It's just when that's all that your religion is, then it's bad. There was also the promise of a happy afterlife if you became one of the initiates. Which means that if you were to join the Jewish community, or eventually the Christian community, then you could be saved, basically. In Roman and Greek religions, you basically went to this, when you died, you went to this big, underground, dark, damp warehouse of the dead. Maybe they're going to make a new horror movie out of that, Warehouse of the Dead. But it's like there's, one faint light bulb hanging down from the ceiling, and you can't really see anything. And it's a big, horrible place that no matter if you were a good person or a bad person, everybody went to this place called Hades. And so in these Eastern religions, especially Judaism, namely Judaism, and then eventually Christianity, it promised that if you're a good person, there's actually going to be a reward for being a good person. If you're a bad person, you'll be rewarded for being a bad person too, with pain and suffering. But for the good people, they will have eternal bliss, they'll be with God, their pains will be relieved. It's a very happy afterlife concept. And so this was very attractive to Romans, who all they knew their entire life was, when I die, it's going to be miserable. No matter how I live in this world, it's going to be miserable in the end. Right? That's very depressing. And so when Judaism comes along and they posit or suggest, hey, it's actually not going to be so bad if you live a good life. Like, oh, now I have a motive to actually do good. Now, in terms of proselytes or converts and God-fearers and pagans, we find these three groups in the New Testament itself. So in terms of the proselytes and the God-fearers, this is referring to the converts and the Noahides. We find these, and you can see the precise citations on the screen, or the sources on the screen, but we find them in Acts 2, in Acts 10, Acts 13, and multiple places throughout these chapters. And then in terms of pagans receiving this gospel of monotheism, we find them in such places, in Acts, definitely, in the latter half of Acts, and then also 2 Corinthians and Galatians. And so we find these three groups interacting and coming in contact with these Jewish missionaries called the apostles. But this is also something that other Jews that were not Nazarenes, this is also probably pretty similar to the experiences that they were having as well throughout the Roman Empire. According to Livy, he remarks on the unreliability of the Roman state religion. He says, "The longer the war dragged on, and the alternation of success and defeat affected both the prosperity and the attitudes of men, an increasing number of religious cults, or religious groups, most of them foreign, invaded the city with the result that either the men or the gods seemed to have changed rather suddenly." So either people started changing their minds, or their deities entered the city. Like, they physically entered the city. No longer did people keep their disaffection with the state religion a secret. People started getting vocal about, our religion sucks. No longer did people keep their disaffection with the state religion a secret, voiced only in private homes. In public places, in the Forum, on the Capitoline Hill, was seen a crowd of women who would not pray or sacrifice to the gods in accordance with ancestral ritual. So basically, people were just giving up the Roman religion. They said, look, our religion sucks, our God sucks, or our deities, plural, suck. We got to find something new. We got to find, and quick, because we need somebody to protect our country and to, show us what to be doing, because what we've been doing doesn't work. According to Tacitus, we find that he expressed some negative opinions about Christians, which at this time Christians were still very closely associated with Jews, and Romans didn't really even know the difference. And sometimes they just thought that they were one and the same thing. And there's reason to believe that, in part because they were. The early Christians were all Jews, and so you can understand why the Romans might be confused. And so maybe they were just a little late to the game. Maybe we'll give them that. Anyways, Tacitus, who was a Roman historian, he says, to put an end to the rumor that he had ordered the fire that destroyed a large part of the city of Rome, Nero invented charges of guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a group of people whom the Roman mob called Christians, or Christianoi, and hated because of their shameless activities. Oh, the shameless activities of the Christians. Right, remember, there was rumors going on that they were committing incest and murder and things like this. It was a dangerous cult, which they use the word almost like we use it today, at least in the way that it's translated nowadays. It was a dangerous cult, which had been kept in check for the moment, but burst forth again not only throughout Judea, so he says it comes from Judea, the origin of the evil, but even in Rome, where all the hideous and shameful things from all over the world flow together in a swarm. People who admitted their belief were arrested, and then later, through their information, a huge crowd was convicted, not so much of the crime of setting the fire, but of hating humankind. Ooh, they're haters of humanity. That's the biggest crime. They just hate people. It's kind of a funny charge nowadays, but unfortunately, this is a charge that has been used throughout history of saying they just hate people. They're just evil. Why? We don't know. They're just evil. They just hate people. It's totally illogical and totally based on emotion. But unfortunately, that's why it works so well, is because people give into emotion much more often and much easier than giving into reason, which we try not to do a whole lot in these lectures. Hopefully we're trying to promote using the control of our rationality over the passion of our hearts, so that we don't so that not led astray. But Tacitus continues. He says, "Mockery was heaped upon them as they were killed, wrapped in the skins of wild animals. They were torn apart by dogs, or nailed to crosses, or set on fire and burned alive to provide light at night, when the daylight had faded. But pity arose, even for those who were guilty and deserved the most extreme punishment, since they seemed to have been slaughtered not for public good, but to satisfy the cruelty of one man, Nero." So we find that the punishment against the Christians was so severe, people started kind of asking themselves, is this really the right thing? I mean, they are haters of humankind, but do we really need to be feeding them alive to animals and nailing them to crosses and burning them alive? I mean, maybe just whip them and, cut off a finger or something. Don't torture them to death. So we find that the Roman public actually starts pitying the Christians. Now, another negative thing. There was the Roman ban on Gentile conversions to Judaism, which is what we covered earlier when we were talking about the religio licita. So in the early 2nd century, there was an order by Caesar Antoninus Pius, and he says that, and he was the emperor from 138 to 161 CE, and he says, "By a rescript of the deified Pius, it is allowed only to Jews to circumcise their own sons. A person not of that religion who does so suffers the penalty of one carrying out a castration." So basically, it is a crime to castrate people, and the Jews are allowed to do their own little circumcision thing. But if Gentiles start circumcising, that's a problem, for whatever reason. And so the emperor basically said, we will punish you as if you're castrating people, as if you're cutting the whole thing off. And so we can see that not only were Gentiles doing this, which kind of goes against the whole idea that, Gentiles weren't supposed to be circumcised, or nobody was teaching that they ought to be circumcised. This is something that was being taught. So it doesn't necessarily go along with what Paul was saying, but Paul was not the only voice in the Nazarenes. He was one guy with one opinion, and other people had opinions too. So speaking of Paul, who was he? We've already kind of covered this. We know that he was a Pharisaic theologian. He was a shaliach, or an emissary, a messenger, a missionary, and he was a teacher. He was sent by James, remember James the Just, Yaakov Tzaddik, to be a teacher of the Noahide laws and the basics of Judaism. He was also an apocalyptic apostle to the Gentiles, and he likely believed that Yeshua would return in a few decades or even sooner. When you look at his writings, it sounds like he thinks Yeshua is coming back any minute, which is partly why many Christians today think the same thing. And in a sense, he was preparing the way for the Lord. So he was kind of taking up this Elijah role upon himself. And he never, I don't think, ever says this explicitly, but he seems to kind of have this mindset. At least that's my opinion. So he was a likely apocalyptically minded because he talked an awful lot about the judgment that was coming and the return of the Lord and Jesus coming to judge the nations and things like this. He was one of the apostles to the Gentiles. I think we often call him the apostle to the Gentiles, but there was actually multiple ones before him and with him, which include Peter and Barnabas and others. So he was not the only one. He was working alongside other people. And he wasn't even the main apostle. In fact, I don't know if the apostles ever call him an apostle. I think Paul just calls himself that. But at any rate, he was working with other people. He had co-workers. He was not the star of the show. And he believed that the end was near. And so this gave him a sense of urgency, and this is probably what helped him and motivated him to go to such great lengths to spread the knowledge of God to the Gentiles, because time's coming, the end is near. If I'm going to suffer at all, it's only going to be for a short time, and then Jesus will come, and God's kingdom will be established, and everything will be fine. So, but we know that this is not how things played out, and so although Paul was mistaken about that, he was certainly adequate motivation for helping get him out there and helping him to go to such great lengths and suffer so many things. Paul was also caught between two worlds. According to Jerome, who I think was from the 400s AD, if I'm not mistaken. Anyways, he came a few centuries after the time of the apostles. Jerome said that Paul was born in Giscala, Galilee, so he was a Galilean according to Jerome. And after Herod's death in 4 BC, there were some revolts in Judea and Galilee that happened. If you remember, Herod persecuted the Galileans, and so this is really not surprising. And so these revolts started erupting, and ultimately baby Paul and his family were exiled to Tarsus. Now, this is, I think, the more likely of the two scenarios that were given, but according to certain Jewish Christians, and that's just the academic term for them, according to some other Jewish believers, Paul was actually born a Gentile and converted to Judaism. However, this is not in line with Paul's claim of being descended from Pharisees and being from the tribe of Benjamin. So, is this account true? Was Paul lying? Who knows? But given that Paul had such extensive knowledge in rabbinic thoughts and rabbinic beliefs, I think that this might have just been a rumor. So, in terms of which one's correct, I think that perhaps Jerome's history of Paul sounds more likely, but ultimately we don't know where Paul came from. All we know is that he has some kind of connection to the city of Tarsus. Paul probably learned his leatherworking craft, he was a leather worker, according to Acts 18, verse 3. He probably learned this from his father, who likely had his own business and was successful enough to purchase Roman citizenship for the entire family. Because at that time, you could just buy citizenship, and then what this would come with is certain rights. For example, the government couldn't just throw you in jail. You had to have a trial. And we see this play out in Paul's own life, right? In the Gospels. In the book of Acts. Not only this, but Paul's father was also a Pharisee, according to Acts 23:6. And he appears to have been rich enough to send his son, Paul, all the way to Jerusalem to be educated by Rabban Gamaliel, according to Acts 22. Thus, Paul was a chassid, a Pharisee, who also had experience with the Gentile world, with Hellenism. And this was kind of a rare fusion of two cultures, but at the same time, I think that makes him a pretty good candidate for bringing Judaism and Jewish ethics and Jewish values into the Gentile world. Now, in terms of Paul's mission, we've covered this quote before in Pirkei Avot 1:12. Maybe you guys will memorize this by the end of our series here. We read, Rabbi Hillel says, Be among the disciples of Aaron, loving peace and pursuing peace, loving people and bringing them close to the Torah. Right, and this is exactly what Paul was doing. He's spreading the knowledge of God, he's spreading knowledge about the Noahide commandments to the Gentile world, and actually sometimes giving them additional commandments as well. He was commissioned to execute James's plan to teach Gentiles 4 commandments, 4 mitzvot, in addition to the things that they were already abiding by, such as belief in one God, abstaining from sacrificing to idols, and things like this. In Acts chapter 13, verses 42 through 48, we read, "As Paul and Barnabas were going out, the people kept begging that these things might be spoken to them the next Shabbat. Now when the meeting of the synagogue had broken up, many of the Jews and the God-fearing proselytes," right, there's those God-fearers, there's the proselytes again, "they followed Paul and Barnabas, who, speaking to them, were urging them to continue in the grace of God." Now it's interesting, Paul and Barnabas were exhorting them to continue in the grace of God, which means they already had the grace of God. But this was before Paul and Barnabas talked to them about Jesus, so how could they have the grace of God? Well, because the grace of God has been within Judaism from the beginning, and so it's not something that they needed to hear about. They already knew it existed. They already had it, which is why Paul and Barnabas say that they had it. But don't just have it in the past, continue in the grace of God. So the next Sabbath, nearing the whole city assembled to hear the word of the Lord. But when the Jews saw the crowds, they were filled with jealousy and began contradicting the things spoken by Paul, and were blaspheming. Paul and Barnabas spoke out boldly and said, "It was necessary that the word of God be spoken to you first, since you repudiate it, and judge yourselves unworthy of eternal life. Behold, we are turning to the Gentiles." So, what is Paul doing? He was actually sent to the Jews first, and then he went to the Gentiles. So he was not the apostle of the Gentiles his entire career. "For as the Lord has commanded us," not just Paul, but more than one people, or more than one person. When he's talking to the whole crowd and he says us, he's speaking to the entire crowd. This was the job of the entire Jewish community. "I have placed you, the Jewish people, as a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth." So Paul is basically saying, look, it was our job to bring Torah knowledge to the entire creation, just as Hillel says, bringing them close to the Torah. You guys aren't cooperating, so I'm going to go it alone, do it by myself. I'm going to go to the Gentiles, whether you like it or not. And when the Gentiles heard this, they began rejoicing and glorifying the word, or the message of the Lord. What was the word of the Lord? That salvation was coming to the Gentiles. Why? Because the Jews were being a light to them, because the Gentiles didn't know any better. They were ignorant. But the Jews had to enlighten them, as it says in verse 47 and in the Torah, where it says that God had made the Jewish people and he placed them as a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the end of the earth. Which is why Yeshua himself says salvation is of the Jews. And Paul affirms it. And Scripture affirms it, the verse that Paul was quoting. So, this is one reason why Gentiles were not afraid of being Judaized. They wanted to be Judaized because they understood that that's how they were saved. Right? There was no problem with that. So in terms of Paul being a missionary to the Gentiles, or emissary to the Gentiles, in Acts 21, verses 22 through 23, James assigns Paul the task of delivering messages to the Gentile world, particularly regarding the 4 laws, the Noahide laws. And we find evidence that Paul taught these in his epistles. So, James gives him, he says, look, here's 4 commandments that the Gentiles need to do in addition to what they're already doing. abstaining from fornication and impurity, which is listed in all these verses, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Colossians, 1 Thessalonians. There was also prohibited foods, which are found in 1 Corinthians. There was abstaining from blood, which if we interpret that to be abstaining from murder, which it almost certainly is referring to, is abstaining from murder, then Romans 1:29 is in accordance with that. There was also synagogue attendance, which we find all over the book of Acts, especially chapter 13 and 17 as well. So here is perhaps one of my favorite slides, especially in this presentation. Here is Paul and the Noahide laws. If you want to know what the Noahide laws are, it is in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin 56 through 60. And by the way, each number is just a page. So 56a and 56b, that's just 2 pages. So 56 through 60, that's going to be about 7 or 8 pages. And they describe all the commandments that Gentiles need to keep. Do not murder, do not steal, do not worship false gods, do not be sexually immoral, do not eat the limb removed from a live animal, do not curse God, set up courts and bring offenders to justice. Now, if you look at the screen, you can find that all of these things were taught by Paul, mostly in Romans, 1 Corinthians, Ephesians and 1 Timothy, and so on. And these are just examples. I just put one passage on the screen just to give you an idea that these things are taught. They're not just things that, the Jews invented, but these are things that Paul taught. So either Paul was wrong in teaching these, or he's going in accordance with what he learned in rabbi school under the guidance of Rabbi Gamaliel. Now, some rabbis at that time also taught that there was a prohibition on men being effeminate, so you couldn't act like a gay boy. And we see that Paul taught this as well. Some rabbis also taught that Gentiles had to observe the Sabbath, and Paul also taught this. In terms of, some rabbis also taught that people ought to honor their parents, which Paul taught in a number of places. And so we find that overall, just kind of summing up the entire presentation, we'll keep it real short, there was mixed feelings by Gentiles about Judaism. The upper echelons of society, the elites, the rich people, they did not like Judaism because it went against traditional Roman values. The lower classes of people, though, they did like Judaism, at least a lot of them did, not all of them, but many of them did, because it offered them a consistent moral system, gave them only one deity to manage instead of 20, or 30, or 100. And this was something that the Gentiles were having to deal with on a much greater level, on a much greater level than even what we're dealing with today, even with, the advent of the Messianic and Hebrew roots movements, is that you think that these movements are very Judaizing. Excuse me. You think these movements are very Judaizing. They were even more back then. They were more so back then. And so as the Gentiles were realizing, this all makes sense now, the Bible is true, then some of them would convert totally to Judaism and become Jews, or they would take on the 7 Noahide laws, the Sheva Mitzvot B'nai Noach. And they would keep these 7 commandments and would often go on to keep more. So sometimes they would observe the Sabbath with them, and then sometimes also observe the holidays, which we see that the Hebrew roots movement and the Messianic movements are doing today. So they're actually not keeping the entire Torah, they're doing what the Noahides did back then, which there's nothing wrong with that. It's actually a fantastic thing what they're trying to do. Whether they do that correctly or not, that's a whole other topic, but the very fact that they're trying, I think is very commendable, and it's nice to see that. It's nice to see people returning, Gentiles returning to their Noahide roots, and some of them going on and trying to keep all the commandments. And so I think that that's very good. But we've gone quite long enough today, so we're not going to have a long outro today. But I think that this is the last lecture in this unit, Unit 2. So I will leave you to watch the outro video, and I will have an exciting time getting into the 2nd century. But before we do that, we're going to be stopping off at the Roman-Jewish Wars, where we encounter one of the biggest events in human history, which is the destruction of the Second Temple. So, as I like to end my videos, be blessed and be a chassid, whether it's a Jewish chassid, a Gentile chassid. Be a righteous person and pursue the commandments that God has given us, whether it's all 613 or just the basic 7. And once you can get a handle on those, maybe consider going on and trying to keep more. So if you would like more information, you can contact our YouTube channel, or you can find us on our website, www.newheartnewspirit, all one word, .com. And thank you for watching. Thank you for getting through Unit 2 with us. I hope that it's been a blessing to you. Hope that it's been eye-opening and exciting. And we'll see you later.